The house loomed at the end of Willow Lane, its faded yellow siding catching the last rays of a chilly March sun. On this particular evening, March 7th, 2025, the air carried a bite that made 16-year-old Amara shiver as she fumbled with her tea. The front door groaned open, its hinges protesting the sudden intrusion, and she stepped inside, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the hardwood floor. She adjusted the straps of her worn purple backpack, the one she'd carried since middle school, and let it thud onto the entryway table. "Mom and Dad won't be back for a week," she narrated aloud to the empty space, her voice a soft melody against the stillness. "It's just me and Ethan now." The foyer smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, a remnant of her mother's last-minute tidying before the trip. Amara's parents had left that morning for a work conference in Chicago, a rare event that required both their presence. Her mother, a nurse with a warm smile and a knack for organization, had married Ethan's father, a reserved accountant, 2 years ago. The blending of their families had been bumpy at times, but Amara clung to the hope that time would smooth the edges. She glanced at the framed photo on the wall, her mother in a white dress, Ethan's father in a stiff suit, and the 2 kids standing awkwardly at their sides. Amara's braids had been freshly done that day, cascading down her back, while Ethan's sandy hair stuck up in odd tufts, as if he'd just rolled out of bed. She smiled at the memory, her dark eyes sparkling with a mix of excitement and nerves. This week, with their parents gone, felt like a chance to bridge the gap between her and her stepbrother. She kicked off her shoes, leaving them in a haphazard pile by the door, and padded into the living room. The space was cozy but dated, with a sagging plaid couch, a coffee table scarred from years of use, and a TV that flickered if you didn't jiggle the remote just right. The windows were bare, letting the dimming light spill across the floor in golden patches. Amara paused by the couch, running her fingers over its worn fabric. "Maybe we could watch a movie tonight," she mused aloud, imagining Ethan sprawled beside her, a bowl of popcorn between them. She'd always admired him. His quiet demeanor, the way he could fix anything with a screwdriver, the sharp wit he rarely showed. He was 18 now, a senior with college on the horizon, and she couldn't help but wonder what he thought of her. Did he see her as just a kid? Or could he feel the same flutter she did when their eyes met? Her thoughts were interrupted by a rustle from the kitchen. She turned, her heart lifting. "Ethan?" she called, her voice bright with anticipation. She crossed the living room in quick strides, her socks sliding slightly on the polished floor, and poked her head through the doorway. There he was, leaning against the counter, a can of soda in his hand. Ethan was lanky, all sharp angles and long limbs, with a mop of sandy hair that fell into his hazel eyes. He wore a faded gray hoodie and jeans, his usual uniform, and his expression was as unreadable as ever. He glanced at her, his gaze lingering for a split second before flicking away. "They're gone?" he asked, his tone flat, almost bored. Amara nodded eagerly, stepping fully into the kitchen. The linoleum was cool under her feet, and the fridge hummed softly in the background. Yup, left this morning. Mom said they'd call when they get to the hotel." She leaned against the counter, mirroring his pose without realizing it. "It's just us now. Kind of weird, right?" She grinned, hoping to coax a smile from him. Ethan popped the tab on his soda, the hiss cutting through the quiet, and took a sip. "Guess so," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the can. Amara tilted her head, undeterred. "I was thinking maybe we could watch a movie later. You know, make it fun since we got the place to ourselves." Ethan shrugged, his shoulders hunching slightly. "I've got stuff to do," he said, brushing past her toward the stairs. His sleeve grazed her arm, and she caught a whiff of the mint gum he always chewed. She turned to watch him go, her smile faltering as his footsteps thudded up the staircase. "Oh," she said softly, more to herself than to him. The kitchen felt emptier now, the hum of the fridge louder in his absence. She crossed her arms, hugging herself against the sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Why does he always do that?" she whispered, her brow furrowing. Upstairs, Ethan shut his bedroom door with a quiet click, leaning against it as if to barricade himself from her enthusiasm. He set the soda on his desk, cluttered with textbooks and a half-built model car he'd been tinkering with for weeks. His room was a stark contrast to the rest of the house, messy, lived in, with posters of old rock bands taped crookedly to the walls and a guitar propped in the corner, its strings dusty from neglect. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Amara's voice echoed in his mind. "Maybe we could watch a movie later," and he grimaced. She was always trying, always pushing, and he didn't know how to make her stop without saying things he couldn't take back. He crossed to the window, peering out at the backyard. The grass was patchy, dotted with puddles from last night's rain, and the old oak tree swayed gently in the breeze. He didn't hate her, not really. She was nice enough, always smiling, always offering something. Food, a game, a conversation. But every time he looked at her, he saw things that set her apart. Her dark skin, the way her braids swung when she laughed, the loudness of her voice that filled every room. She wasn't like him. Wasn't like the kids he'd grown up with in this small, mostly pale town. His dad had brought her into his life, and he'd never asked for that. "Just keep her at a distance," he muttered to himself, turning away from the window. "She'll figure it out eventually." Downstairs, Amara wandered back to the living room, her socks scuffing against the floor. She flopped onto the couch, pulling a throw blanket over her lap. It was blue, knitted by her grandmother years ago, and its familiar softness steadied her. She stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks that spiderwebbed from the light fixture. "He's just shy," she told herself, nodding as if to make it true. "He'll come around. I just have to try harder." Her mind buzzed with ideas, cooking dinner, suggesting a walk, maybe even digging out that old board game collecting dust in the hall closet. She wasn't blind to his coldness, but she chalked it up to his personality. Ethan was quiet, guarded, a puzzle she was determined to solve. She glanced at the stairs, imagining him up there in his room, probably hunched over that model car he loved. She'd seen him work on it once, his fingers steady and precise, and it had made her heart skip. "He's not so bad," she narrated softly, tucking her legs under her. "He just needs time. And I've got a whole week to show him I'm not going anywhere." Her optimism was a shield, one she'd built over years of navigating new schools, new neighbors, new stepfamilies. Being black in a town like this hadn't always been easy. Whispers at the grocery store, stares on the playground, but she'd learned to push through with a smile. Ethan was just another challenge, and she'd win him over. She was sure of it. The house settled around her, its creaks and groans a familiar lullaby. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and the last of the daylight bled away, leaving the room in a soft gray haze. Amara reached for the remote, flicking on the TV to chase away the quiet. A cartoon blared to life, its bright colors dancing across the screen, but her mind was elsewhere. She pictured Ethan's face, those hazel eyes that never quite met hers, the way his mouth tightened when she got too close. "Tomorrow," she promised herself, pulling the blanket tighter. "Tomorrow, I'll get through to him." Unseen by Amara, Ethan stood at the top of the stairs, his hand resting on the banister. He'd come down for another soda but paused when he heard her voice, that soft narration she did when she thought no one was listening. He couldn't make out the words, but the sound grated on him, a reminder of her presence he couldn't escape. His grip tightened, knuckles whitening, before he turned back to his room. "A whole week," he muttered, shutting the door again. "Great." The house stretched out between them, silent and vast, its walls holding secrets neither could yet imagine. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen curtains, casting a soft golden glow over the chipped white cabinets and the worn linoleum floor. It was Saturday, March 8th, 2025, the second day of Amara and Ethan's week alone. And 16-year-old Amara stood at the counter, a whisk in hand and a determined glint in her dark eyes. She wore a faded green t-shirt and pajama pants dotted with tiny stars, her braids pulled back into a loose ponytail that swayed as she moved. The house was quiet, save for the faint drip of the faucet and the rhythmic clink of the whisk against the mixing bowl. "If I make breakfast, he'll have to sit with me," she narrated aloud, her voice a hopeful thread in the stillness. "It's a start." She'd woken early, her mind buzzing with plans after yesterday's lukewarm encounter. Ethan's shrug and swift retreat to his room had stung, but Amara wasn't one to give up easily. She'd learned that lesson long ago. Whether it was mastering a tricky math problem or winning over a skeptical classmate, Persistence paid off. Now, as she poured batter into a sizzling pan, the kitchen filled with the warm, sweet scent of vanilla and cinnamon, she hummed a tune her mother used to sing, a lilting melody about sunshine and new days, and flipped a pancake with a flourish. "Perfect," she said, admiring the golden brown circle before sliding it onto a stack. She'd made extra just for Ethan, hoping the gesture would thaw his icy edges. Upstairs, Ethan stirred in his bed, the faint aroma of pancakes tugging him from a restless sleep. He groaned, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. His room was a cluttered cave. Textbooks piled on the desk, a tangle of headphone cords dangling from a shelf, and a poster of a vintage Mustang peeling at the corner. The guitar in the corner stared at him accusingly, its strings untouched for months. He sat up, his sandy hair a mess, and tugged on the same gray hoodie he'd worn yesterday. The smell from downstairs was undeniable, and his stomach growled despite his reluctance. "She's at it again," he muttered, his voice rough with sleep. He didn't want to go down there, didn't want to face her bright smile and endless chatter, but hunger won out over pride. Amara heard his footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, like he was debating each step, and her heart leapt. She smoothed her shirt, suddenly self-conscious, and turned just as he shuffled into the kitchen. "Morning," she chirped, gesturing to the table where 2 plates sat, each piled with pancakes drizzled in syrup. A glass of orange juice gleamed beside his, the pulp catching the light. Ethan paused in the doorway, his hazel eyes flicking from the food to her face. He looked tired, shadows under his eyes, but she didn't comment. "I made extra for you," she said, sliding his plate a little closer. "Figured you'd be hungry." Ethan hesitated, his fingers tightening around the hem of his hoodie. The kitchen felt too small with her in it, her energy bouncing off the walls. But the pancakes looked good, better than the stale cereal he'd planned on, and he couldn't ignore the rumble in his stomach. "Thanks," he said gruffly, dropping into the chair across from her. He kept his eyes on the plate, spearing a piece with his fork and shoving it into his mouth. The sweetness hit him first, then the hint of cinnamon, and he had to admit it was decent. Not that he'd tell her that. Amara beamed, sitting opposite him with her own plate. The table wobbled slightly under her elbows, a reminder of the time her stepfather had promised to fix it, but never did. She didn't mind. It felt like home. "So," she began, cutting her pancake into neat triangles, "what's your favorite movie? I was thinking we could pick one tonight. Mom left that big box of DVDs in the living room, and I saw some action ones you might like." She glanced at him, hopeful, her fork hovering mid-air. Ethan's fork paused, syrup dripping onto his plate. He chewed slowly, buying time. Her voice was too loud, too eager, and it grated on him like sandpaper. "I don't really do movies," he said, his tone clipped. He took another bite, focusing on the food so he wouldn't have to meet her gaze. Amara's face fell, but she rallied quickly. "Oh," she said, forcing a smile. "What about games then? We've got that old board game in the closet, Monopoly, I think. Could be fun, right?" Ethan's jaw tightened. He set his fork down, the clink loud in the quiet. "I've got homework," he said, pushing his chair back. The legs scraped the floor, a harsh sound that made Amara flinch. He stood, leaving his plate half full, and headed for the stairs without another word. Amara stared after him, her fork still in hand. "Okay," she whispered, her voice small. "Maybe later." The kitchen felt colder now, the pancakes congealing on his plate, and she poked at her own food, appetite fading. "Why won't he even try?" she narrated softly, her eyes tracing the grain of the table. Upstairs, Ethan lingered just out of sight, his hand gripping the banister. He'd heard her whisper, that quiet question she didn't mean for him to catch, and it twisted something in his chest. Guilt maybe, but he shoved it down. He didn't owe her anything, not his time, not his attention. She was always there, always pushing, and he couldn't breathe around it. He climbed the rest of the stairs, shutting his door with a thud, and flopped onto his bed. "Just stay away," he muttered, staring at the ceiling. But her face flashed in his mind, those wide eyes, that hopeful smile, and he clenched his fists. She wasn't like him, wasn't part of his world, and he didn't know how to tell her that without breaking something he couldn't fix. Downstairs, Amara cleared the table, stacking the plates with mechanical precision. The orange juice sat untouched, a silent rebuke, and she poured it down the sink, watching the pulp swirl away. She turned on the faucet, letting the water drown out the quiet, and scrubbed the dishes with more force than necessary. Soap suds clung to her hands, the scent sharp and clean, and she narrated her thoughts to the empty room. He didn't even finish. But he said thanks, so that's something. Maybe he's just not a morning person. She nodded to herself, clinging to the sliver of optimism like a lifeline. I'll try again later. Something different. He can't avoid me forever. She dried her hands on a dish towel, the fabric rough against her skin, and wandered to the living room. The plaid couch sagged under her weight as she sank into it, pulling her knees to her chest. The TV remote lay on the coffee table, its buttons worn from years of use, and she grabbed it, flicking through channels without really watching. Cartoons blared, then a cooking show, then static. But her mind was upstairs with Ethan. She pictured him hunched over his desk, that model car he loved spread out in pieces, and wondered what it'd take to get through to him. He's not mean, she told herself, twirling a braid around her finger. Just distant. I can fix that. The morning stretched on, the sun climbing higher and spilling through the bare windows. Amara got up, restless, and poked around the hall closet. It was a mess of coats, scarves, and forgotten junk. Her mother's old knitting bag, a broken umbrella, a box of holiday lights that hadn't worked in years. Tucked in the back, she found it. The Monopoly box, its corners dented and its lid faded from red to a dull pink. She pulled it out, dust puffing into the air, and grinned. This'll work, she narrated, brushing off the top. Everyone likes Monopoly. You'll have to play if I set it up. She hauled the game to the living room, spreading it out on the coffee table. The board was creased, the money wrinkled, but it was intact. She sorted the pieces, choosing the top hat for herself and setting the car aside for Ethan because she'd seen how much he liked cars. Perfect, she said, arranging the property cards in neat stacks. She glanced at the stairs, debating whether to call him down now or wait. Later, she decided, settling back on the couch. After lunch, he'll be in a better mood then. Upstairs, Ethan sat at his desk, a textbook open but unread. The model car, a sleek black Mustang, sat half-assembled, its tiny parts scattered like confetti. He picked up a wheel, rolling it between his fingers, but his mind wasn't on it. He could still smell the pancakes, still hear her voice. Could be fun, right? And it gnawed at him. She didn't get it. She didn't see how different they were, how her laugh filled spaces he wanted empty, how her dark hands moved too fast when she talked. He dropped the wheel, letting it clatter onto the desk, and leaned back in his chair. A whole week of this, he muttered, rubbing his temples. She needs to back off. The house creaked around them, its walls soaking up their separate silences. Downstairs, Amara hummed again, shuffling the Monopoly money like a dealer in a casino, her hope unshaken. Upstairs, Ethan stared at the ceiling, his resentment simmering just below the surface. The day was young, and the game of trust had only begun. The house on Willow Lane stood bathed in the pale light of a midweek sun, its yellow siding dulled by a thin layer of dust that had settled since the last rain. It was Wednesday, March 11th, 2025, the fourth day of Amara and Ethan's solitary stretch, and 16-year-old Amara stood before her bedroom mirror, a flutter of determination in her chest. Her room was a small sanctuary, walls painted a soft lavender, a twin bed draped in a quilt her grandmother had sewn, and a desk cluttered with sketchbooks and colored pencils. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the dust motes that danced in the air, and she squinted at her reflection, tugging at the hem of a bright yellow dress she'd pulled from the back of her closet. If I dress up nice, maybe he'll notice me differently, she narrated aloud, her voice a mix of hope and nerves. The dress was simple but bold, its color like a burst of summer against her dark skin, and she twirled once, watching the skirt flare before settling against her knees. She'd spent the past few days trying to crack Ethan's shell. Pancakes on Saturday, the Monopoly board still sitting untouched on the coffee table, a casual offer to walk to the corner store on Monday that he'd brushed off with a grunt. Each rejection stung, but Amara's optimism was a stubborn flame, flickering but unextinguished. She smoothed her braids, tied back with a matching yellow scrunchie, and adjusted the thin silver necklace her mother had given her for her last birthday, a tiny star pendant that glinted in the light. He's got to see I'm trying, she told herself, nodding at her reflection. Today's the day. I'll make him smile, even just a little. Downstairs, the living room was quiet, the TV off for once, its screen a blank mirror reflecting the plaid couch and the Monopoly board she hadn't had the heart to pack away. The air smelled faintly of the lavender candle she'd lit last night, a scent that lingered like a ghost of her fleeting calm. Amara padded across the hardwood floor, her bare feet cool against the grain, and paused by the stairs. She could hear faint music drifting from Ethan's room, something with a heavy bass line, muffled through the closed door. Her stomach flipped, a mix of excitement and dread, but she squared her shoulders. "Here goes nothing," she whispered, narrating her resolve as she headed for the kitchen to grab a glass of water and steady her nerves. The kitchen was as she'd left it that morning, the breakfast dishes dried in the rack and the curtains fluttering slightly from a breeze sneaking through the cracked window. She filled a glass from the tap, the water cold against her lips, and took a sip, her eyes drifting to the backyard beyond the glass. The old oak tree stood sentinel, its branches swaying gently, and a pair of sparrows flitted between them, their chirps a soft counterpoint to the distant thump of Ethan's music. She set the glass down, wiping her hands on her dress, and turned toward the living room again. "He's probably on the couch by now," she mused, picturing him sprawled there, phone in hand, like he'd been yesterday afternoon. It was time. Sure enough, Ethan was there when she stepped back into the room, his lanky frame stretched across the couch like he owned it. He wore his usual gray hoodie, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, and a pair of faded jeans with a rip at the knee. His sandy hair fell into his hazel eyes as he scrolled on his phone, the screen's glow casting shadows across his sharp features. The music from upstairs had followed him down, leaking faintly from the earbuds dangling around his neck. He didn't look up as Amara approached, her shadow falling across the coffee table, but she didn't let that stop her. "Hey," she said, striking a playful pose with one hand on her hip and the other twirling a braid. "What do you think? Cute, right?" She grinned, tilting her head so the sunlight caught the yellow of her dress, making it glow. Ethan's thumb paused on his screen, and he glanced up, his gaze flickering over her for a brief, reluctant second. His face hardened, the lines of his mouth tightening, and he looked away fast, back to his phone. "It's fine," he said, his voice flat, almost swallowed by the hum of the earbuds. Amara's grin wavered, but she perched on the armrest of the couch, undeterred. The fabric was rough under her thighs, and she swung her legs slightly, the motion a nervous tick she couldn't quite stop. "Fine's better than nothing," she narrated silently, clutching that scrap of approval like a lifeline. Out loud, she pressed on. "You're always so quiet. Don't you ever want to hang out? We've got the whole week. Just us. Could be fun." She leaned forward a little, her star necklace dangling, and watched his face for any crack in his armor. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders hunching as if he could shrink away from her. Her voice was too bright, too close, and it grated on him like a song he couldn't turn off. He tugged one earbud free, letting it dangle, and rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm good by myself," he said, his tone sharper than he'd meant it to be. He kept his eyes on his phone, scrolling through nothing now, just moving his thumb to avoid looking at her. Amara tilted her head, her braids brushing her shoulder. "But we're family now," she said, her voice softening. "I just want us to be friends, maybe more." The words slipped out before she could catch them, her cheeks warming as her crush spilled into the open air. Ethan froze, his thumb stalling mid-scroll. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with her confession, and he stood abruptly, his movements sharp and jerky. "That's not happening," he snapped, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. He stepped around the coffee table, nearly knocking over the Monopoly board, and headed for the stairs, his earbuds swinging wildly. Amara's heart sank, her hands clenching in her lap. "Wait," she started, but he was already gone, his footsteps pounding up the stairs like a drumbeat of rejection. She sat there, the couch armrest digging into her thighs, and stared at the empty space he'd left behind. "What did I say wrong?" she whispered, narrating her confusion to the silent room. Her eyes stung, but she blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. The yellow dress felt silly now, too loud, too much, and she tugged at the hem, wishing she'd stayed in her pajamas. "He didn't even look at me," she murmured, her voice trembling. Not really. She slid off the armrest onto the couch proper, curling into the corner where Ethan had been, and pulled a throw pillow into her lap. It smelled faintly of him, mint gum and something woodsy, and she hugged it tight, trying to piece together where she'd misstepped. Upstairs, Ethan stormed into his room, slamming the door so hard the guitar in the corner rattled against the wall. He paced the cramped space, his sneakers scuffing the faded rug, and muttered under his breath, "She doesn't get it. She's not my type, not even close." His hands clenched into fists, then unclenched, and he sank onto his bed, the springs creaking under his weight. The room was a mess. Textbooks splayed open, the model Mustang still half-built, a pile of laundry spilling from a hamper, but it was his, a refuge from her relentless energy. He yanked the earbuds from his neck and tossed them onto the desk, the cord tangling with a screwdriver. He didn't hate her, not exactly. She was nice, too nice sometimes, always cooking or chatting or leaving little notes like the one on the fridge yesterday. "Leftovers in the oven if you're hungry." But every time she got close, he saw it. Her dark skin glowing in that stupid yellow dress, her braids swinging like they had a life of their own, the way her laugh filled every corner of the house. She wasn't like him, wasn't like the girls he'd grown up with, pale and quiet and familiar. His dad had brought her into his life, and he'd never signed up for that. "Why can't she just leave me alone?" he growled, flopping back on the bed and staring at the ceiling, where a water stain spread like a gray cloud. Downstairs, Amara uncurled herself from the couch, smoothing the pillow back into place. The Monopoly board caught her eye, its pieces still waiting, her top hat his car, and she sighed. "Maybe I pushed too hard," she narrated, running a finger along the board's edge. But he didn't have to snap like that. She stood, brushing off her dress, and wandered to the window, peering out at the street. A neighbor's dog trotted by, a shaggy mutt with a wagging tail, and she smiled faintly despite herself. "I'll try again tomorrow," she decided, nodding as if to seal the promise. "Something smaller. Less me." She laughed softly, a sound that didn't quite reach her eyes, and turned back to the room. The afternoon dragged on, the house settling into its usual creaks and groans. Amara retreated to her room, kicking off her sandals and flopping onto her bed. She grabbed a sketchbook from her desk, flipping to a blank page, and started doodling. A sunflower, its petals bold and bright like her dress. "He'll come around," she murmured, her pencil scratching against the paper. "He has to." The star necklace glinted as she moved, a tiny spark of hope she clung to, even as doubt nibbled at its edges. Upstairs, Ethan lay still, the bass line from his earbuds a distant memory. He rolled onto his side, staring at the Mustang on his desk, its sleek lines mocking his tangled thoughts. "She's not my type," he repeated, quieter now, as if testing the words. But her voice echoed in his head. "Maybe more." And he squeezed his eyes shut, willing it away. The week stretched out before him, endless and suffocating, and he wondered how much longer he could keep her at arm's length before something broke. The house held its breath, the space between them vast and uncharted, as the spark of Amara's hope flickered against the growing shadow of Ethan's resistance. The sky over Willow Lane hung heavy with clouds on Friday, March 13th, 2025, the 6th day of Amara and Ethan's week alone. Rain lashed the windows of the house, a relentless drumming that matched the restless beat in 16-year-old Amara's chest. She stood in her bedroom, the lavender walls dim in the storm's gray light, and adjusted the wick of a candle on her desk. The flames sputtered to life, casting a warm glow over her sketchbooks and the quilt bunched on her bed. She wore a soft blue sweater and leggings, her braids loose and spilling over her shoulders, and her star necklace glinted faintly as she moved. "If he won't talk, I'll make him listen," she narrated aloud, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She'd lit 3 candles, lavender, vanilla, and a cinnamon one from last Christmas, hoping their scents would calm her nerves for what she planned next. The week had worn her down. Pancakes hadn't worked, Monopoly sat abandoned, and her yellow dress had earned her nothing but a snapped rejection. Ethan's coldness had chipped away at her optimism, but Amara wasn't ready to surrender. She'd spent the morning flipping through a photo album she'd found in the hall closet, its pages crinkled with memories of their parents' wedding 2 years ago. One picture stuck with her. Her mother in a white dress, Ethan's father in a stiff suit, and the two of them, Amara with her braids and Ethan with his messy hair, standing side by side, not quite smiling. "They wanted us to be a family," she murmured, tracing the photo with her finger. "I just need him to see that." Downstairs, the house groaned under the storm's weight, the wind rattling the windows and sending drafts through the cracks. The living room was a shadowed cave, the plaid couch sagging under a throw blanket she'd left there last night, the Monopoly board still mocking her from the coffee table. The TV sat silent, its remote buried somewhere in the cushions, and the air carried a damp chill that made Amara shiver as she descended the stairs. She paused in the foyer, her socks slipping on the hardwood, and glanced at the kitchen. A pot of soup simmered on the stove. Chicken noodle, her mother's recipe, its savory aroma mingling with the candle's sweetness. She'd made it for dinner, another quiet offering to Ethan, but her real plan waited upstairs. She crossed to the hall table, where she'd left the photo album, and picked out the wedding picture, clutching it like a talisman. The paper was cool against her fingers, its edges worn from years of handling, and she studied it again, her dark eyes searching Ethan's frozen face for clues. "He wasn't always like this," she narrated softly, though she wasn't sure if that was true. She'd only known him since the wedding, a stranger thrust into her life by their parents' vows. But she'd seen him laugh once, months ago, when his dad had told a dumb joke about taxes, and that memory fueled her now. "I'll talk to him," she decided, nodding to herself. Really talk. No games, no tricks, just the truth. The stairs creaked under her weight as she climbed, the storm's roar growing louder with each step. Ethan's door loomed at the end of the hall, a slab of chipped white paint with a faded sticker of a skull peeling at the corner. Music thumped faintly from within, something loud and angry, a wall of sound he'd built to keep the world out. Amara took a deep breath, the candle scents clinging to her sweater, and knocked. "Ethan?" she called, her voice soft but firm. "Can we talk? Please?" She pressed the photo to her chest, her heartbeat thudding against it, and waited. Inside, Ethan sprawled on his bed, one arm flung over his eyes, the other tapping a rhythm on his stomach. His room was a chaos of shadows, textbooks piled haphazardly, the model Mustang gathering dust, a tangle of cords snaking across the floor. The storm rattled his window, rain streaking the glass, and the bass from his speakers pulsed through the air, drowning out the world. He'd spent the day avoiding Amara, skipping breakfast after smelling her soup, hiding out here with his music and his thoughts. Her knock cut through the noise, sharp and unwelcome, and he groaned. "What now?" he muttered, dragging himself upright. He shuffled to the door, his sneakers scuffing the rug, and yanked it open, frowning down at her. "What?" he asked, his voice rough over the music. Amara stepped inside before he could stop her, the photo crinkling in her grip. His room smelled of stale laundry and mint gum, a stark contrast to the candlelit warmth she'd left behind. She stood by his desk, the Mustang's sleek lines catching her eye, and held out the picture. "Look," she said, her tone earnest. "It's from Mom and Dad's wedding. They wanted us to be a family. Why do you hate me?" Her words hung in the air, raw and unguarded, and she watched his face, searching for a crack in his stony mask. Ethan's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he glanced at the photo. The music thumped on, a relentless heartbeat, and he crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I don't hate you," he said, but his voice was cold, clipped like he was spitting out something bitter. He didn't take the picture, didn't move closer, just stood there, a wall of gray hoodie and guarded eyes. Amara pressed on, stepping toward him, her socks silent on the rug. "Then why do you avoid me?" she asked, her voice trembling now. "Every time I try, pancakes, games, anything, you just walk away. I like you, Ethan. A lot." Her cheeks burned as she said it, her crush laid bare, and she reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his sleeve. Ethan jerked back, his movement sharp, instinctive. "Stop it," he said, his voice rising over the music. "You're not? I don't feel that way. Just leave me alone." His words cracked like thunder, and Amara's eyes widened, her hand freezing midair. "Not what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The room seemed to tilt, the storm outside roaring louder, and she took another step, closing the gap. "Is it because I'm black?" The question slipped out, a fear she'd buried under layers of hope, and it hung between them, heavy and sharp. Ethan froze, his breath catching. Guilt flashed across his face, a fleeting shadow, before anger surged in its place. "Get out," he growled, his hands clenching into fists. He didn't answer her question, didn't dare, but his silence screamed louder than words. Amara shook her head, tears prickling her eyes. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "Tell me the truth, please." She stepped closer still, the photo slipping from her fingers to the floor, and reached for him again, desperate to bridge the chasm she'd just named. Something snapped in Ethan, her closeness, her voice, the accusation he couldn't deny. It was too much. He shoved her, harder than he meant to, his palms slamming into her shoulders. Amara stumbled back, her foot catching on a pile of books, and she fell, her head striking the edge of his desk with a sickening thud. "Ow!" she cried, clutching her forehead, her vision swimming as she crumpled to the rug. Pain bloomed hot and sharp, a trickle of warmth seeping through her fingers. Blood, she realized dimly, staring at her stained hand. Ethan stared, panic clawing up his throat. No, I didn't mean," he stammered, his voice cracking as he dropped to his knees beside her. Her sweater was askew, her braids splayed across the floor, and the photo lay crumpled nearby, a silent witness. Amara blinked up at him, tears mixing with the blood on her cheek, and whispered, "Why?" before scrambling to her feet. She staggered out, her sobs echoing down the hall as she fled to her room, slamming the door behind her. Ethan stayed kneeling, his hands shaking as he stared at the spot where she'd fallen. The music pounded on, oblivious, but the room felt silent, hollow. "I didn't mean it," he muttered, his voice lost in the storm. He reached for the photo, smoothing it out, and saw her face, smiling, hopeful, so unlike the girl he'd just hurt. Guilt gnawed at him, but anger lingered too, a tangled knot he couldn't unravel. He stood, tossing the picture onto his bed, and punched the wall, the sting in his knuckles a fleeting distraction. "She pushed me," he growled, pacing again. She wouldn't stop. In her room, Amara curled on her bed, the quilt pulled tight around her. Blood smeared her pillow, a dark stain against the pale fabric, and she pressed a tissue to her forehead, wincing as the cut throbbed. The candles still burned, their scents cloying now, and she narrated through her tears. "He hates me. He really does." Her sweater sleeve was damp with rain and blood, and she hugged herself, rocking slightly. I thought he'd see me." The storm raged outside, a mirror to the chaos within, and she stared at the ceiling, her hope fracturing under the weight of his rejection. Downstairs, the soup bubbled over, unnoticed, its steam rising into the empty kitchen. The house creaked inside, its walls absorbing the fallout of their breaking point. Amara's sobs faded into hiccups. Ethan's pacing slowed to a restless stillness, and the night stretched on, dark and unyielding, as the rift between them widened beyond repair. The dawn broke gray and silent over Willow Lane on Saturday, March 14th, 2025, the 7th and final day of Amara and Ethan's solitary confinement in the house. A thin mist clung to the windows, blurring the world outside, and the air carried a damp chill that seeped through the cracks of the old yellow-sided home. 16-year-old Amara lay curled on her bed, the quilt tangled around her legs, her blue sweater stained with dried blood from last night's fall. Her room was a dim cocoon, lavender walls muted in the weak light, the desk cluttered with sketchbooks and stubs of candles that had burned out hours ago. The cut on her forehead throbbed, a dull ache beneath the makeshift bandage she'd fashioned from a tissue and tape, and her dark eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, tracing the familiar cracks. "I won't give up on him," she narrated softly, her voice hoarse from crying. "Not yet." The events of Friday night replayed in her mind like a broken reel. Ethan's shove, the crack of her head against his desk, the blood on her hands as she fled. She'd locked herself in here after, sobbing into her pillow until exhaustion claimed her, but sleep had offered no escape. Dreams of his angry face, his growled, "Get out," had jolted her awake before dawn. She rolled onto her side, wincing as the movement tugged at her injury, and pulled the quilt tighter. The star necklace lay on her nightstand, its chain tangled, a silent reminder of the hope she'd clung to all week. "He didn't mean it," she whispered, narrating to steady herself. "He was just mad. I pushed too hard." Her optimism, battered but unbroken, flickered like a candle in the wind. Downstairs, the house bore the scars of neglect. The soup pot sat cold on the stove, its contents congealed, and the living room's plaid couch sagged under the weight of yesterday's blanket. The Monopoly board remained on the coffee table, its pieces untouched, a monument to Amara's failed efforts. The storm had passed, leaving a hush that amplified every creak and groan of the old structure. Amara sat up slowly, her braids falling into her face, and swung her legs over the bed's edge. Her socks were mismatched, one blue, one gray, from a frantic change last night, and she rubbed her eyes, wiping away the crust of dried tears. "I'll find him," she decided, nodding to herself. "I'll say I'm sorry, and we'll start over. One last try." She stood, steadying herself against the desk as a wave of dizziness hit, and shuffled to her mirror. The girl staring back looked tired, shadows under her eyes, a bruise blooming around the cut, but she forced a smile, small and shaky. "He's my brother now," she narrated, smoothing her sweater. "Sort of. Family doesn't give up." She grabbed a hair tie from the desk, pulling her braids into a loose ponytail, and slipped the star necklace back on, its cool metal grounding her. Then she padded to the door, her socks whispering against the hardwood, and stepped into the hall. Ethan's door was closed, no music leaking out this time, just silence. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob, then pulled back. "Not yet," she murmured, narrating her caution. "He's probably still sleeping. I'll wait." She descended the stairs, each step creaking under her weight, and wandered into the kitchen. The pot of soup mocked her from the stove, its surface crusted over, and she sighed, grabbing a sponge from the sink. "Might as well clean up," she said, turning on the faucet. The water hissed, cold at first, then warm, and she scrubbed the pot, the rhythmic motion soothing her frayed nerves. Steam rose, carrying the faint scent of chicken broth, and she hummed softly, a tune her mother used to sing when she was upset. Upstairs, Ethan stirred in his bed, the gray light filtering through his window, rousing him from a fitful sleep. His room was a wreck, textbooks splayed open, the model Mustang abandoned, a pile of clothes spilling from the hamper onto the rug. He lay sprawled across the mattress, one arm dangling off the side, his gray hoodie bunched around his waist. The events of last night gnawed at him, Amara's fall, her blood on the floor, the way she'd looked at him, hurt and confused. He groaned, rubbing his face with both hands, and sat up, his sandy hair sticking up in wild tufts. "Stupid," he muttered, his voice rough. "So stupid." He didn't know if he meant her or himself, but the guilt sat heavy in his chest, tangled with the anger he couldn't shake. He swung his legs over the bed, his sneakers still on from yesterday, and stood, stretching until his back popped. The wedding photo lay crumpled on his pillow, a relic of her plea, and he picked it up, smoothing it out. Her face smiled up at him, bright and hopeful, and he grimaced, tossing it onto the desk. "She doesn't get it," he growled, pacing the small space. "Never will." Her voice echoed in his head. "Is it because I'm black?" And he clenched his fists, the question a splinter he couldn't pull out. He didn't hate her, not really, but she was too much, too different, too close, and he didn't know how to live with that. Downstairs, Amara finished the dishes, stacking the pot in the drying rack, and wiped her hands on a towel. The kitchen felt warmer now, the mist outside thinning as the sun fought to break through. She glanced at the clock, 9:17 a.m., and nodded. "He'll be up soon," she narrated, crossing to the living room. She straightened the blanket on the couch, fluffed the pillows, and paused by the Monopoly board, her fingers brushing the top hat. "Maybe not a game," she murmured, "but something. I'll find him where he's comfortable." Her mind flashed to the garage. Ethan spent hours there tinkering with an old bike he'd dragged home last summer. "Perfect," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. She slipped on a pair of sneakers by the back door, their laces frayed, and stepped into the garage. The space was a concrete cave, smelling of oil and rust, its walls lined with shelves of tools and junk. The bike sat in the center, a rusted frame with a new chain glinting in the dim light from a single bulb overhead. Ethan's toolbox lay open nearby, wrenches and screwdrivers scattered like fallen soldiers. Amara ran a hand over the bike's handlebars, narrating her plan. "He loves this thing. If I'm here when he comes down, he'll have to talk to me." She perched on a stool, her sweater catching on its splintered edge, and waited, her star necklace swaying as she rocked slightly. Ethan trudged downstairs an hour later, his stomach rumbling. The kitchen was empty, the soup gone, and he frowned, peering into the living room. No Amara. Relief flickered, then unease. He hadn't heard her leave. He grabbed a soda from the fridge, the can cold against his palm, and popped it open, the hiss loud in the quiet. Then he heard it, a faint hum from the garage. "Great," he muttered, taking a sip. "She's everywhere." He considered retreating upstairs, but the bike called to him. He'd been meaning to adjust the chain all week. "Fine," he growled, narrating his surrender. "I'll get it over with." He pushed open the garage door, the hinges squeaking, and froze. Amara sat there, her blue sweater stark against the gray concrete, her smile tentative but warm. "Morning," she said, hopping off the stool. "I'm sorry about yesterday. Can we start over?" Her voice was soft, earnest, and she stepped toward him, her sneakers scuffing the floor. Ethan's grip tightened on the soda can, his jaw clenching. "Just go," he said, his tone low, almost a plea. He set the can on a shelf, brushing past her to the bike, and grabbed a wrench, his hands trembling slightly. Amara didn't move. "Please, Ethan," she said, her voice steadying. "I know you're better than this. We're family. I don't want to fight." She stepped closer, close enough to smell the mint gum on his breath, and reached out, her hand hovering near his arm. "I just want—" Something snapped in him. Her voice, her closeness, the weight of her words, it was too much. He spun, the wrench still in his hand, and shouted, "I said go!" His eyes blazed, wild with panic and rage, and he swung, blind with it, the tool arcing through the air. Amara's eyes widened. "Ethan, wait." The wrench struck her temple, a dull crack echoing in the garage, and she crumpled lifeless to the concrete floor. Blood pooled beneath her head, dark and spreading, her star necklace glinting in the dim light. Ethan dropped the wrench, the clatter deafening, and gasped, "No, no, no." He fell to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her still form. "Amara?" he whispered, shaking her shoulder. She didn't move, her chest still, her eyes blank. Panic clawed at him, his breath hitching as he stared at the blood, the wrench, her broken body. "I didn't mean it," he narrated, his voice cracking. "It was an accident." He scrambled back, his sneakers slipping in the blood, and pressed himself against the wall, his hands shaking. The garage spun, the bike a blurred silhouette, and he squeezed his eyes shut, willing it undone. But when he opened them, she was still there, still gone. "What do I do?" he muttered, his mind racing. The house was silent, the street empty. No one had seen, no one would know. He stood, staggering to the toolbox, and grabbed a tarp from a shelf, its plastic crinkling in his grip. Hours passed in a haze. He dragged her body to the backyard, the mist cloaking him as he worked. The old oak tree loomed, its roots gnarled, and he dug, the shovel biting into the damp earth. Sweat mixed with tears, his hoodie soaked, and he narrated his cover-up. "No one will know. It was an accident. I didn't mean it." He laid her in the shallow grave, the tarp crackling as he folded it over her and covered her with soil, patting it down with trembling hands. The star necklace glinted one last time before disappearing under the dirt. Back in the garage, he cleaned, scrubbing the blood with a rag, hiding the wrench in a drawer, washing his hands until they were raw. The house settled around him, its silence oppressive, and he collapsed on the couch, staring at the Monopoly board. "She's gone," he whispered, narrating his lie. "She ran off. That's all." The words felt hollow, but he clung to them, building a story no one could unravel. The final night closed in, the mist thickening outside, and the oak tree stood silent, its secret buried deep. The mist lingered over Willow Lane on Sunday, March 15, 2025. A gray shroud that softened the edges of the old yellow-sided house. The air was thick with damp, the scent of wet earth rising from the backyard where the old oak tree stood, its branches drooping as if burdened by an unseen weight. Inside, 18-year-old Ethan sat on the plaid couch in the living room, his lanky frame hunched forward, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. His gray hoodie was stained with faint traces of dirt, its sleeves pushed up to his elbows, and his sandy hair fell into his hazel eyes, unwashed and wild from a sleepless night. The Monopoly board still sat on the coffee table, its top hat and car pieces untouched, a silent relic of Amara's last efforts. The house was quiet, too quiet, its creaks and groans muted as if it held its breath alongside him. Ethan stared at the floor, the hardwood scuffed from years of footsteps, and narrated his lie to himself. "She ran off. That's all anyone needs to know." His voice was low, a rasp barely audible over the hum of the fridge in the kitchen. He'd spent the night crafting the story. After burying Amara under the oak, he'd returned to the house, scrubbed the garage floor with bleach until his hands burned, and hidden the wrench in a box of old tools in the basement. Then he'd sat at the kitchen table, a pen trembling in his grip, and forged a note in her looping handwriting. "I'm staying with a friend. Don't worry. Amara." He'd studied her sketches, her notes on the fridge to get it right, and left it on the counter, crumpled just enough to look hasty. The clock on the wall ticked toward noon, its hands creeping with agonizing slowness. Their parents were due back soon, his father and Amara's mother, blissfully unaware of the week's unraveling. Ethan's stomach churned, a mix of dread and hunger, but he couldn't eat. The soup pot sat clean in the drying rack, the kitchen restored to order, but the air still carried a faint whiff of chicken broth, a ghost of her last meal. He stood, his sneakers scuffing the floor, and wandered to the window, peering through the mist at the oak tree. The fresh dirt was hidden beneath a layer of fallen leaves he'd scattered at dawn, a clumsy camouflage. "No one will look there," he muttered, his breath fogging the glass. "No one will know." The sound of tires on gravel jolted him from his thoughts. He turned, heart pounding, as a familiar blue sedan pulled into the driveway. His father, Mark, climbed out first, his thinning hair damp from the mist, his suit rumpled from the long drive. Amara's mother, Lila, followed, her nurse's scrubs traded for a sweater and jeans, her warm brown eyes scanning the house with a tired smile. Ethan forced his legs to move, crossing to the front door and opening it before they could knock. "Hey," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "You're back." Lila stepped inside, shaking droplets from her coat, and hugged him briefly, her arms strong but weary. "Good to see you, Ethan," she said, her voice a melody he'd always found too loud. "Where's Amara?" Mark followed, lugging a suitcase, and set it by the stairs, his brow furrowing as he glanced around. "Yeah, where's your sister?" he asked, his tone casual but expectant. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry, and gestured toward the kitchen. "She, ran off," he said, stepping back to let them pass. "Left a note, said she's staying with a friend." Lila frowned, her smile fading, and hurried to the counter, snatching up the note. Her fingers traced the words, her lips moving silently as she read. "This doesn't sound like her," she murmured, turning to Ethan. "Which friend? She didn't say anything about this before we left." Ethan shrugged, shoving his hands into his hoodie pockets to hide their shaking. "Dunno. She didn't tell me much. Just took off yesterday, I guess." His voice was flat, rehearsed, and he avoided her gaze, focusing on a scratch on the linoleum. Mark joined Lila, peering over her shoulder at the note. "Huh," he said, scratching his chin. "That's odd. She's never done this before." He looked at Ethan, his gray eyes narrowing slightly. "Everything okay while we were gone? You two get along all right?" Ethan nodded too quickly. "Yeah, fine, just, normal stuff." He forced a half smile, his lips tight, and turned away, grabbing the suitcase as an excuse to move. "I'll take this upstairs," he muttered, escaping to the hall. Lila watched him go, her brow creased with worry. "I'll call her friends," she said, pulling her phone from her purse. "She should have told us." Mark nodded, sinking into a kitchen chair. "Probably just teenage drama," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "She'll turn up." Lila dialed, her fingers tapping nervously, but each call went unanswered or met with confusion. None of Amara's friends had seen her. The house seemed to shrink around them, the silence pressing in as the afternoon wore on. Upstairs, Ethan dropped the suitcase in his parents' room, its thud echoing in the quiet. He lingered by the window, staring at the oak tree again, its branches swaying gently in the mist. "They'll believe it," he narrated, his voice a whisper. "They have to." But doubt gnawed at him, a cold knot in his gut. He'd covered his tracks, the garage was spotless, the wrench buried in the basement, the note a perfect mimicry, but her absence was a void he couldn't fill. He sank onto the bed, the springs creaking, and rubbed his temples, the memory of her fall flashing behind his eyes. The wrench, the blood, her still body. "It was an accident," he muttered, clinging to the lie. Days turned to weeks, and Amara didn't return. Lila and Mark searched tirelessly, calling her phone, which went straight to voicemail, posting flyers around town, alerting the police. The town buzzed with whispers, neighbors peering from behind curtains as officers canvassed the street. "Runaway," some said, nodding sagely over coffee at the diner. "Kids do that sometimes." Others weren't so sure, their eyes lingering on the house, its yellow siding a beacon of unease. A detective came by, a stout man with a notepad and a skeptical frown, and questioned Ethan in the living room. "When did you last see her?" he asked, pen poised. Ethan sat stiffly on the couch, the Monopoly board still there, gathering dust. "Friday night," he said, his voice even. "She was upset, said she needed space, then left the next day." The detective scribbled, his gaze flicking to Ethan's hands, clean but faintly red from scrubbing. "Upset about what?" he pressed. Ethan shrugged, his hood up, shadowing his face. "Dunno, we argued a little, normal stuff." The detective nodded, but his eyes lingered, sharp and searching, before he thanked them and left. Lila sobbed that night, her cries echoing down the hall, and Mark paced the kitchen, muttering about what they'd missed. Ethan stayed in his room, the guitar untouched, the Mustang model abandoned, and stared at the ceiling, narrating his mantra, "No one knows, no one will." Spring faded into summer, the mist giving way to heat that baked the earth. The oak tree grew lush, its roots drinking deep, and the patch of disturbed soil blended seamlessly with the lawn. Lila hung Amara's sketches in the living room, their bright colors a stark contrast to the gloom that settled over the house. Mark threw himself into work, his silence a shield, while Ethan finished his senior year, graduating with a hollow smile in photos his father snapped. The police investigation dwindled. No leads, no body, just a missing girl who'd slipped through the cracks. The case went cold, filed away in a dusty cabinet, and the town moved on, its whispers fading to murmurs. But the house remembered. Its walls held the echoes of Amara's laughter, her humming, her narrated hopes, now silenced beneath the oak. Ethan lived on, his days mechanical, school, home, sleep, repeat. He avoided the garage, its concrete floor a ghost of her blood, and the backyard where the tree loomed like a judge. At night, he dreamed of her. Her yellow dress, her star necklace, her voice asking, "Why?" and woke in a cold sweat, his hands clenched in the sheets. "It was an accident," he whispered into the dark, but the words felt thinner each time, worn by repetition. One evening, months later, he sat on the back porch, the air thick with cicadas' hum. The oak stood tall, its leaves rustling, and he stared at it, his soda can forgotten in his hand. A shadow moved, a trick of the light maybe, but he flinched, his breath catching. "She's gone," he narrated, his voice trembling. "That's all that matters." But the tree seemed to watch him, its branches swaying in a breeze he didn't feel, and he stood, retreating inside, the door slamming behind him. The mystery endured, a quiet wound in the fabric of Willow Lane. Neighbors speculated over fences, kids dared each other to touch the oak, and Lila left Amara's room untouched, a shrine to a girl who'd never come home. Ethan carried the truth, a secret buried deeper than her body, and the house settled into its silence, its yellow siding fading with time. No one ever knew. Not the police, not their parents, not the town. The oak tree stood sentinel, its roots entwined with her memory, and the shadows it cast grew longer, darker, a mystery no one could solve.